I'm not sure whether to assume everyone who's here came because of the words Leo Strauss in the title, or whether many of them came because of the words liberal education in the title. I'm going to take the risk of assuming somewhere in between, and say a little, but only a little, about who Strauss was, in case you didn't especially come for that reason. But I feel somewhat awkward doing so, or maybe actually reassured doing so, because I see at least two people in the audience, George Anastopoulos and Ralph Lerner, who knew Leo Strauss much longer and much better than I. So I'm afraid to say anything in front of them. On the other hand, if you ask me any tough questions, I can refer you to them. So I feel better about it. I will, having done this for several audiences in which some of you were present, I will give the brief version. Leo Strauss was born in a small village in Hesse in Germany in 1899. He left Germany in 1932 on a Rockefeller Fellowship, first to Paris and then to England. Between Germany and France and England, he wrote several books, one on Spinoza's Critique of Religion, one on Maimonides and his predecessors, and one on Hobbes. In 1937, I believe, he came to the United States, first as a researcher at Columbia, and then for about a decade at the New School for Social Research in New York, where many of his colleagues were also European refugees and exiles. Indeed, it was referred to as the University in Exile. In the winter quarter of 1949, he came to the University of Chicago as a member of the political science department, Robert Hutchins having been instrumental, to say the least, in his being hired there, and taught through the fall quarter of 1967 at this university, where he delivered his lectures on natural right and history that became probably his best-known book, and on his lectures on Machiavelli that became Thoughts on Machiavelli, one of his more difficult books, on which I not taught, a seminar last quarter. He left the university in the winter of '68, going first to Claremont Men's College in California, where I had the privilege of studying with him for a year, and then I'm going to get this right, in 1969 went to St. John's College, Annapolis, where he spent the last years of his life till his death in October of 1973. His books have had a great impact. I think he is increasingly recognized, maybe even more so abroad than in the United States, as one of the foremost thinkers of the 20th century. I just got back a few weeks ago from a conference on his thought in Rome, where several Italian scholars who had written books, one of them 3 books on Strauss, were giving papers. There have been conferences I've been invited to, not all of which I've attended, on his thought in France, the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and I'm probably leaving some out. His works have been translated into more languages than I can recall. And he also, and perhaps especially important for us at the university, had an enormous impact as a teacher. Students of his who went and did important scholarly work in philosophy, in classics, and above all in political science. And his teaching helped to inspire many other teachers, including ones at the University of Chicago, including the 2 I mentioned who are in the room today, as well as Alan Bloom, who was Martin mentioned earlier, and of course Joseph Cropsey and Herbert Storing, and Amy and Leon Cass. Strauss is probably best known for his attempt to recover what he called classical political philosophy and to challenge what he saw as the foremost. Let me switch glasses here, Mark, so I can actually see them rather than my notes. There they are. I wasn't sure if the room was empty. It was quiet for a minute. That's better. Now I can hear it too. He challenged what he saw as the chief obstacles to a recovery of classical political philosophy, what positivism and what he called historicism. He argued, perhaps most notoriously, for a distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric teachings of many writers of the past, and attempted to reopen not only the issue between ancients and moderns, but that between reason and revelation. Martin has already plugged the center that I now direct. If you go to our website, which is www.Leo Strauss Center, but actually I prefer that you Google Leo Strauss and then check on us, because that increases our Googleability. You can now hear the digitally remastered audio files of about 25 of the courses that he taught. You can download them, put them on your iPod, and stroll about listening to his courses once again. And we do plan to also have transcripts, both of the ones for which the audio files survived and the ones for which the audio files have perished, transcripts of his courses on our website over the next several years, if all goes well, both financially and editorially. My hope is that we can have something like a core session, at which point I will sit down today, taking as our text his lecture, which was a commencement address at the basic program for adult education in June of 1959, on what is liberal education. I have been led to understand you were given a link that could enable you to read those 8 pages. And here too, perhaps I'll steer a middle course between assuming everyone has read it and assuming that they haven't, and give what is, on the one hand, a brief summary of this brief commencement address, and on the other hand, what I hope will raise some issues that could structure our discussion. And so what I want to say along those lines is as follows, that this brief commencement address gives, I think, 3 different accounts of, or 3 different justifications in any case, of liberal education, each of which raises lots of questions we might want to discuss, and I won't rule out, though I'd rather not start with discussions, questions pertaining to the political controversy that Martin alluded to, that he encountered at that bar in Washington. So the first couple of paragraphs of this lecture present a notion of liberal education as the culture of the mind in accordance with its nature. What he, we'd have to put quotation marks around it, since he says this is what other people call it, what you could call an, quote, absolute notion of liberal education, which seems contrary to the relativism of our times, and which has at least two difficulties that Strauss points out. On the one hand, if liberal education means learning from the great minds of the past through the great books they left behind, they all contradict each other. People who talk about the Western tradition as if it gave us some unified, unequivocal, uplifting, edifying teaching haven't read very many of those books because they say all kinds of contrary and difficult things, not all of them edifying, and certainly not all of them in agreement. Secondly, the Western culture, and again, one does have to bear in mind Strauss is speaking to the basic program, which at least at that point, someone can update me now, was teaching only Western texts. I'm actually aware that it no longer is so confined. And there are other traditions, Chinese and Indian, he mentions, worth studying. Then in the next two paragraphs, the third and fourth paragraphs of the talk, he makes what he calls a fresh beginning. I hope I'm doing this right. Yes, a fresh start, which takes a rather different tack as to the just meaning, I think, and certainly the justification of liberal education, a much more political and much more contemporary account of why liberal education, justification of it here and now in modern liberal democracy. That modern liberal democracy was originally conceived of by people like Spinoza, Rousseau, Jefferson, as depending on the virtue of the people, so that they would be, the virtue and wisdom of the people, so that they would be capable of ruling, or at the very least, here I veer actually to the sequel paper he gave, Liberal Education and Responsibility, where he quotes Jefferson as saying that democracy is the best means of selecting the natural aristoi to rule, as we recently did here for our new mayor. That the original intention or meaning of liberal democracy was meant to be a kind of universal aristocracy, and that therefore liberal education is essential to liberal democracy as the education that would make its citizens wise and virtuous enough to rule. Then in the somewhere in the fifth paragraph, after a strange consideration of, well, could we reject modern liberal democracy? Could we reject modernity? Could we reject civilization altogether and go back to pre-literate societies, which he rejects as self-contradictory? He concludes again that we are compelled to live with books, but gives what seems to me a different justification, either from that first one of liberal education as the culture of the mind, or the second one, the more political one, of liberal education as the servant of liberal democracy. He gives a Socratic justification of liberal education, based not on the assumption we know the absolute truth about culture or the nature of the mind, but on the contrary, based on our ignorance. It is a Socratic, or we could say, given what he says in these last paragraphs, a philosophic justification. That is to say, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, then he speaks here of, well, we can't be philosophers if philosophers are what Plato says they are, worthy of being kings. We can be lovers of philosophy, philosophers, and returns to the problem that he raised with the first notion at the beginning. The greatest minds and the great books that the basic program was and is devoted to contradict each other. We're compelled, if we want guidance about the most important issues from the people who are thought to have had the most wisdom about them, to be the judges between Plato and Nietzsche, between Kant and Hegel, even though we are ourselves inferior to them. But it's unavoidable. That's our situation, that we can, if we want to listen to what he calls the conversation amongst the greatest minds, we have to conduct it. They don't, they, as he says, engage in monologues. We have to create the dialogue. And we have no alternative given what he calls the loss of all simply authoritative traditions in our time. We can't simply follow tradition, including that, quote, Western tradition I spoke of earlier. We have to think for ourselves. So my hope, before I sit down and bring the mic over there, is that we could talk perhaps about all three of these notions or justifications of liberal education. It as the education in the culture of the mind, liberal education as what liberal democracy needs, and this more Socratic or philosophic one, something we're compelled to do by our ignorance. But maybe before doing so, it would be useful to put on our table here other notions of liberal education, because I think it's fair to say that none of the three notions or justifications of liberal education that Strauss gives, all of which, of course, and not only because he was addressing the basic program, all of which do revolve around some notion of learning from great books. I think none of those notions could be said to be the dominant notions of liberal education today. So I thought maybe just ask people, not necessarily to speak in their own name, but what do people say liberal education is these days, or how do they justify it? Liberal education presumably would not be the only education any liberally educated person would have. One hopes that before they get a liberal education, they perhaps got a moral education from their parents or their pastors. One would hope they learned, to read and write and count and things like that, and have some experience of life. I don't think one can make sense of the great books that Strauss talks about apart from one's experience of life. Martin referred, I forget what the adjective was, to Alan Bloom. Legendary. No, he actually existed at Cornell University. As I have distinct memories. And in the closing of The American Mind, Alan tells a story of how one student, unnamed in the book, sends him a postcard from Italy saying, "You're not a professor, you're really a travel agent." And how pleased he was with this idea, because he thought, I think Strauss as a European in some sense probably took this for granted or didn't think about it, I don't know. Bloom certainly thought you couldn't really appreciate what Machiavelli says if you've never seen Florence. I don't know if Leo Strauss ever saw Florence. So I'm not sure he would have thought that was quite as necessary, but he had his fill of experience in Europe from 1899 to, well, depending on whether you count England part of Europe, to 1932 or 1937. But I'm not sure we should say that is liberal education. I think getting the experience is of life, both whether it's a matter of seeing foreign countries or of experiencing love and loss and sadness and injustice. Those things are just crucially important to education, and liberal education without them would be very thin. I mean, I can't really speak on behalf of the whole faculty, obviously, on this matter. I'll say a few things, maybe first just about the core, the first part of your mention. Now, I came the year after you left. I came in the fall of '77 and had, during my job visit, been essentially interviewed not only by the Department of Political Science, which hired me, but also by the staff of Political Order and Change. I remember Roger Weiss taking me for a tour of the campus that February of 1977. It was the coldest day of the century at that point. It was about minus 20 degrees, and I thought he was actually taking me to his office. It took me a while to realize Roger was giving me a tour. Once we had gone to the circle, I began to realize that. But in any case, I joined the staff of Political Order and Change, as well as the Political Science Department. And it was very much as you describe it a year before, with common exams, staff meetings, et cetera. Given my obligations to the Political Science Department, would only teach one quarter. I taught sometimes the fall and sometimes the winter. I never taught the spring that had all the political economy in it that I felt intimidated by. Ralph Lerner can fill in the details. Somewhere in the 1980s, that course came to a halt and disappeared. And then a few years later, Ralph and some other colleagues, not including myself, created a new social science core course called Classics of Social and Political Thought. Roger was no longer available, and the political economy part that disappeared, so there were no economists teaching in it. But I do think it's true that, well, first of all, one very important thing happened, and I think John Boyer probably must get much of the credit for this. Sometime in the 1990s, it became the case that every appointment to the university, with maybe a few exceptions I'm not supposed to know about, every appointment explicitly required a faculty member to teach half their courses in the college and one of them in general education, and that's certainly just become the standard. Everybody practically teaches in the core now. The college, of course, is twice as big as it was when you left and when I came. It was about 2,500 then, and it's 5,000 now. And the arithmetic, you can do the arithmetic yourself. There's no way. And another good thing that John Boyer has done is, unlike this UnCommon core class, the core sections in the humanities and the social sciences are now absolutely capped at 19, which is a lot smaller than when I came and you left, and is a lot better for discussion purposes than 28 or whatever one had then. But if you do the arithmetic, 19 and X hundred faculty, so we now a large portion of the core sections are taught by the Harper Schmidt Fellows, who do teach who are wonderful people who, in a better job market, would have tenure track positions at major universities and liberal arts colleges, and they now and they teach all through the year, which does provide a continuity that the typical faculty participation does not. I can't speak for the other core sequences, but Classics of Social and Political Thought has very lively staff lunches in which we pretend we're talking about how shall we teach the material, but really are arguing with each other about the material. And I think those are great, and I've gotten to know people that way. And again, I can't speak about the humanities at all. In the social sciences, I think the fact that the social sciences this diaspora took place, we are no longer all in the social science building, has diminished somewhat the legendary, to borrow your word again, teas in the social science tea room where Milton Friedman and Hans Morgenthau and Leo Strauss and Edward Banfield would argue about things no longer take place. One sees colleagues in different places and in committees and seminars and the workshop system, which came in the 80s, that Keith Baker was largely responsible for, I participate semi-regularly in the political theory workshop, where faculty from classics and divinity and history, as well as political science, are involved, and that's a good thing. But so, I mean, that's personal, impressionistic. The picture as a whole, I couldn't attempt to sketch. And I've had the blessing these past 20 years, is that true? Yeah, time flies, of also being a member of the Committee on Social Thought, where I've gotten to know people from different disciplines and have done a lot of co-teaching with Robert Pippin, Glenn Most, Jonathan Lear, our former colleague Betty Howland, and above all Ralph Lerner, which has been a great experience for me. And as I mentioned in another context earlier, sometimes attend colleagues' classes. Earlier this quarter, I attended Heinrich Meyer's class on Strauss's thoughts on Machiavelli. So these things still happen. Whether they happen more or less, I don't know. I'll add that am not a graduate. Unlike you, I am not an alumnus of the University of Chicago. I did my undergraduate work at Cornell, as was mentioned earlier, and my graduate work starting at Claremont Graduate School, as was mentioned earlier, and finishing at Harvard. But my father is an alumnus of our college, class of '39. My daughter is an alumna of our college, class of 2006. Hey, it's her 5th reunion. Why isn't she here? She's attending a wedding in Iowa. And my son will graduate from our college in 2012. He had a list, basically almost the same list as your granddaughter. He got applied to Michigan and Michigan State and Wisconsin and Indiana and Iowa and Texas, and went to Iowa. And for various reasons got sick of Iowa, or maybe Iowa City, and decided to transfer to the University of Chicago, which is taking him some time because Iowa had no core requirements, and we do. And so as I do think after a total of 5 years, he will graduate next year and is having a great time here in a different way than people did in Iowa City. I don't know. I tend, I mean, some of my friends, some of my best friends amongst the faculty say things somewhat similar to Karen and complain about the students. I'm not like that. I love the students. We have wonderful students. I mean, I think I've had as wonderful students these past 5-6 years as I did my first 5-6 years here in the college. I mean, I'd say that also for the graduate students, I think. I mean, the first thing that struck me when I came from Harvard, where I had been on the faculty the 3 years before, was, A, the students came to class here. That was different. That it seemed to be sort of like the center of their lives for many of them. And the second thing that struck me as so different from Harvard was the math students and the pre-med students and the physics students were taking these upper-level courses in the things I taught, Plato, Machiavelli, Locke, and were often the best participants, whereas, I mean, you never saw them at Harvard. They were off doing their thing. And I think that remains the case in my experience. When I read applications, usually for the college, and one of the ones that most struck me was a self-confessed math nerd, math team prize winner and all, who was explaining why he wanted to come to the University of Chicago. He said, I don't want to go to a school, presumably he meant MIT, there would be all math nerds. I want to go to a school where there are all kinds of nerds. And he did come to the University of Chicago instead of MIT. I just have a much more cheerful view of these matters. Now, it may be, it's not based on a scientific sampling. It's based on the students I see, who are by definition, a self-selected, even in the core, the ones who choose our core sequence, classics of social and political thought, and or ones who pick my section would not necessarily be a cross-section. For example, relevant to what you said, I see very few econ majors. They don't take, few of them take our course, and they're 18% of the college. They're the largest major. So although I have a really rosy, cheerful picture of what our students are like, it may not be based on a scientific sample. He speaks of the idea of universal error, starting to say that basically that democracy presumes that everyone in the society will become an aristocrat. In the sort of sequel essay, he quotes Jefferson as saying that democracy is the means whereby the people are well enough educated to select the natural aristoi, as I mentioned earlier, as we do in the city of Chicago, to be our alderman and mayor. So it's not clear we're speaking of a subset as an aristocracy, or the effort to broaden into a universal one. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that to use the fashionable word, there is something elitist, obviously, about Strauss's approach, whichever version you take here. That is to say, he speaks of great minds and great books. He doesn't think all minds and all books are equal. He thinks you can learn more from Plato than from X-Men. I'm not sure if my children would all agree, but and I am too ignorant to say, too ignorant of X-Men. So certainly, in a way, just I think the premise of everything he says there, and of that great books version of liberal education, which is, nobody said, but I was hoping they would say, I'll have to say it for them in a minute. But that great books version of liberal education assumes there's such a thing as greatness, that there's Plato or Kant or Hegel or Nietzsche have something to teach us because they are in some ways, even though they contradict each other, wiser than we are. And in that sense, it's certainly elitist or inegalitarian. Or to put it in terms of what he says at the end of the lecture, there's both a boldness and a modesty involved in liberal education. There's a modesty in which you say, when you pick up the Critique of Pure Reason, you say, wow, a human being could write this? How? I can't even imagine what it would be like to have thought this through myself. He must have been of a superior kind to me. And I don't mean to only say that for philosophy. Read Shakespeare. I think have the same sense. So there's that modesty, or to put it more sharply than he does there, a sense of inferiority on one's own part is presumed, but also a boldness. Boldness, as he says there, both to think that maybe common accepted opinions are wrong, and the boldness to conduct that dialogue, to say, well, Plato seems a lot smarter than me, but so does Nietzsche. I guess I have to think myself, which is bold. Yeah. The thing no one has said, which I was sort of hoping for, because one does hear it in our college and elsewhere, is that liberal education is teaching people, quote, how to think. That it's teaching them methods, critical methods. rather than what to think or even what to think about or what books to read. So it doesn't matter what books you read or what you think about, as long as you're thinking critically or correctly, which is a very different notion of what liberal education is and would not in itself point to the great books. The most obvious problem with that approach is it seems to presume there's some agreement amongst us as to how to think, that there is a critical method we all embrace, whereas in fact the people who say it disagree radically amongst themselves. Some of them mean that you should learn Adorno's critical theory or Marxism or Freudianism or analytical logic. We get to the same problem, that Plato and Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and Aristotle disagree about how to think. So there seems to be some begging of the question in those who think that liberal education can just teach us how to think without great books and without what to think or what to think about. I think I'm pretty much in agreement with you on this. I mean, I don't actually think of myself as an advocate of great books education in the sense in which it is often invoked. I do actually think of even though I have greatly enjoyed, as a member of the Committee on Social Thought, teaching books that are way outside my specialty, I still actually do believe in scholarship and expertise too. I, for example, would, if at all possible, try to avoid ever teaching a book where I cannot read it in the original language. That's why I had to persuade Mr. Lerner to teach with me in the winter quarter a course on the political philosophy of Al-Farabi, as I don't read Arabic or feel really confident about that tradition. And Strauss, of course, himself was, in a way that few of us could aspire to be, a specialist, an expert, a scholar who read many languages. There is that strange, in some ways, irritating line or frustrating line in this lecture where he says, well, it would be good to study China and India too, but we don't know their languages and we can't learn all languages. I mean, this from a man who read, help me, Ralph, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian. Why not? But even that, but it still expresses the notion that you need some kinds of expertise. The core does, in some ways, encourage or compel faculty to teach outside their expertise, but it's nice to have someone in the room at the staff meeting who has the expertise to prevent one from saying really foolish things, you know. So I certainly think that there needs to be some combination of the generality that liberal education requires and specialization. I was not here in the Hutchins College as my father was in its earliest days in the late 30s. But I don't mind the fact that our students have majors and get some quasi or preliminary expertise in one field as well as having the core. And if I could say something that some of my colleagues and close friends might regard as heretical, I don't even mind that in the late 90s we somewhat reduced the core requirements so as to make more room for electives and for majors, mainly for electives, given the way it worked out. I think the core is still alive and well. Now that's partly because I'm in the social sciences and we refuse to reduce our core at all. The humanities, they were willing to reduce their core. We refused, so it didn't really affect us. But I think the fact that undergraduates today are able to take more electives, and about which I have more mixed feelings, that more and more of them do double majors, which I don't think is really necessary, but which they really couldn't have done or would have been much harder to do under the pre-1998, 99 set of core requirements. But it didn't bother me at the time. I did not sign the faculty petitions objecting to the reductions at that time. They seemed to be not unreasonable. So now everyone will be furious. No, I didn't mean to imply this wasn't, in a sense, a method, but it's certainly not a method in the strict sense. Sure. Strauss says at the beginning that it means studying the great books with the proper care. Then in an aside he says, you could write volumes and volumes about what is the proper care. And elsewhere in his correspondence with the German hermeneutic philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, Strauss says, I don't believe in the possibility of a theory of interpretation. I think each interpretation is sui generis, is different. There aren't rules or a method of interpretation even. And then makes this very disconcerting remark in a way, both reassuring and disconcerting remark. He says to Gadamer, in every book I've studied, there's always been something, I'm not sure I can quote it, the adjective right, of great importance, I forget what the adjective, that I didn't understand. You know? Whereas presumably if you had a method, you would understand everything in every book you had if there were such a thing. So obviously it's speaking in a kind of loose colloquial way, it's a method, it's a way of liberal education to say we should read the greatest books by the greatest minds. We'll then argue about which they are, but maybe we'll agree that Plato's Republic is one of them and the X-Men comic books aren't. It seems to me, in some ways, that the crucial thing about the kind of liberal education that Strauss argued for is the notion that one is studying these books because you think you would learn something from them that would help you to understand your world and lead your life, that you're not studying them to learn about them or about their time or place or the society that, quote, produced them, because you're presuming they weren't produced by a society, but by a mind that was not simply a reflection of its society. In saying that, I don't necessarily wish to imply that the opposite is true of cultural studies, but certainly there is a difference.
Sure.
There. I think that premise, or at least hypothesis, that one could learn things of that kind from some kinds of books, probably not from all, though, I mean, again, Mr. Anastopoulos and Mr. Lerner can correct me. I mean, I don't know, Strauss, we know, was a regular watcher of Gunsmoke and Perry Mason. Did he think he was learning from them? Or what? I leave it to them to explicate. Fairly comfortable and happy with where we are curricularly, if that's an adverb, that students take the core. They take some courses that I give where you're reading some old book over 10 weeks, but they also learn something of the quote methods of, I'm a political scientist, so I say quote methods because political science, as some of you may know, is not a coherent discipline. There are 23 different methods and everybody's arguing about them, but they learn something about the methods of a discipline. They learn something about contemporary thought. I think it would be unhealthy if one read nothing but great books. How would you know they were great if you didn't read some third-rate books too? And also, how would you understand the world you live in if you're not reading the prevalent, influential kinds of thought in your own society, which are probably lodged in the back of your own mind too, if you and in some ways filtering your reading of Kant or Plato. I think it is crucial for people to study contemporary things that are here and now, too. I certainly don't see myself as an advocate of a education of great books and nothing but great books. One of the interesting things about Strauss's courses, which you can now access, listen to through our center's website, is that whereas in his published books he tends to talk almost exclusively about, quote, great books, in the courses he sometimes devotes weeks to Ernest Nagel and R.G. Collingwood and other contemporary thinkers. His course on the Introduction to Political Philosophy, the last half or slightly less than half is on Aristotle's Politics, but the whole first half is on what were for him, not for us, contemporary thinkers who are defenders of the positivism or historicism that Strauss himself critiques. I think his, in some sense, I think he thought that you could not simply turn to the great books without confronting the obstacles to doing so, which are a different set of obstacles in our time than they were in his time, of the kinds of thoughts that say that that's impossible or even immoral or wrong to be reading old books by dead white males. We have to leave the room.